London, 1891. A man walks into Baker Street, not seeking help, but demanding justice for a crime Sherlock Holmes swears he never got wrong. What happens when the world's greatest detective is forced to face his own mistake? Stay with me for a gripping tale of pride, truth, and redemption, told in the style of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And before we begin, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment with your favorite Holmes moment, and subscribe for more classic-style mysteries every week. It was upon a particularly raw November morning in the year 91 that Holmes and I were taking our breakfast in the familiar comfort of our Baker Street rooms. A pale light filtered through the fog-laden air, and the steady rattle of hansom cabs drifted up from the street below. Holmes, with his usual disregard for the hour, had already immersed himself in a sheaf of correspondence, while I contented myself with the perusal of the Times. The door flew open without ceremony, and Mrs. Hudson's voice, tinged with alarm, preceded a man's abrupt entrance. He was of middling height, his frame gaunt yet tense, with eyes that burned as though they had known little rest. His clothes, though brushed and mended, bore the unmistakable wear of long hardship. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I come to you not for aid, but for reckoning." Holmes laid aside his papers with the unhurried grace of one who measures all things by their import rather than their urgency. "You have the advantage of me, sir," said he, motioning toward the armchair by the fire. "Your name?" "Harold Latimer," the man replied, declining the seat. "3 years ago you stood in the witness box and spoke the words that sealed my fate. You told the court that I had stolen Lady Charlotte Ashcombe's diamond necklace. For that testimony, I spent those years in Wandsworth prison." Watson Spoon paused midway to his lips, for the name and the case were both known to me. I recalled the night of the gala, the confusion in the Ashcombe drawing room, and the singular piece of evidence, a cufflink, that Holmes had declared decisive. Holmes steepled his long fingers, his eyes narrowing. "If memory serves, Mr. Latimer, the evidence was damning." Latimer reached into his coat and produced a folded copy of the Times, spreading it upon the table so that the headline faced us. "Read this, Mr. Holmes. The man arrested in Paris last week, Jules Marat, has confessed to the theft of the necklace. Yet the Yard refuses to lift a finger to clear my name." Holmes scanned the column swiftly. His expression betrayed no emotion, yet I, who knew him as well as any man could, saw a minute tightening at the corners of his mouth. "You believe, then," Holmes said quietly, "that an error was made?" "I believe," Latimer returned, "that your error cost me 3 years of my life." For the first time in my long association with him, I saw Holmes momentarily without an answer. Holmes rose from his chair and took a few measured steps toward the hearth, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He stood thus for some moments, gazing into the small fire that Mrs. Hudson had coaxed into life that morning. "At the time, Mr. Latimer," he said at last, "the facts were coherent and conclusive. It is the duty of any witness, expert or otherwise, to present his observation without sentiment. The law then weighs it as it will." "The law," Latimer replied bitterly, "is only as sound as the man who guides it. And you, sir, guided it straight into ruin for me." His words struck with the force of a lash, but Holmes merely inclined his head, as though absorbing a blow he neither sought to return nor could dismiss entirely. Watson, unable to remain silent, leaned forward in his chair. "Holmes, whatever the verdict of the past, surely you owe it to yourself, and to this man, to ensure the truth is at last laid bare." Holmes did not turn, but his voice carried a faint edge. "You imply, Watson, that my pride might restrain me from revisiting my own conclusions." "I imply nothing," I said evenly, "save that even the keenest mind can be misled by what appears certain." Latimer's gaze moved from me to Holmes, his jaw clenched. "If you will not act, then I must. And know this, Mr. Holmes, when a man has nothing left to lose, he does not always act within the law." The threat hung heavy in the air. Without another word, Latimer turned on his heel and strode from the room, the door closing with a decisive click behind him. For several moments, silence reigned, save for the ticking of the mantel clock. Holmes resumed his seat, his eyes fixed upon a point in space as if tracing an invisible diagram. "You see, Watson," he said at length, "a man's conscience can be as persistent as any client. I shall review my notes from the case, if only to quiet that particular voice." But in the faint crease of his brow, I knew that Holmes' purpose was not mere quietude. Holmes drew the dispatch box from its accustomed place beneath the window and set it upon the table with a certain finality. The worn brass lock yielded at his touch, and he began lifting out neatly labeled bundles of papers until one, marked Ashcombe necklace theft, lay before him. "You will observe, Watson," he said, untwisting the string with nimble fingers, "that the essentials of the matter were straightforward. Lady Charlotte's necklace disappears during the interval between the third and fourth quadrilles at her gala. The guests are numerous, but our suspect, Mr. Harold Latimer, was seen in the corridor leading to the dressing room." I nodded. "And the cufflink, found upon the carpet by Inspector Lestrade, bore his initials." "Just so. But—" Here Holmes spread the photographs and statements before us. "I am struck, after all this time, by how little attention I gave to the cufflink's provenance. I accepted Lestrade's assertion that it was Latimer's without independent verification." "That is unlike you, Holmes," I remarked. He smiled faintly, though there was little mirth in it. "Even I am subject to the narcotic influence of an apparently perfect chain of reasoning. The cufflink seemed the natural link, if you will pardon the expression, between the man and the crime." He took up a magnifying lens and examined a photograph of the offending object. "Note, Watson, the chaste design about the edge, a pattern not common in England. The metal, too, is gilt rather than solid gold, suggesting a craftsman of the continent. Curious that I did not remark it then." Holmes rose abruptly, thrusting the file beneath his arm. "I shall speak with Lestrade. There is a loose rivet in the framework of this case, and I must see whether the whole edifice will topple when touched." It was a raw and gusty afternoon when Holmes and I made our way to Scotland Yard, the wind chasing the fog in ragged wisps along the embankment. Lestrade received us in his cramped office, where the scent of stale tobacco and damp wool mingled with the odor peculiar to the yard. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said he, leaning back in his chair with a look that suggested he had more pressing duties. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Holmes set the slim file upon the desk. "The Ashcombe affair, Lestrade. You recall the matter?" Lestrade's brow furrowed. 3 years ago, wasn't it? Necklace, cufflink, open and shut. Latimer went down for it." "Indeed. It is the cufflink I wish to speak about. You found it yourself." "I did," Lestrade replied, his tone a trifle sharper. "In the ladies' dressing room, no question of that. Had his initials plain as day." Holmes' eyes, gray and penetrating, never left the inspector's face. "And did you, at the time, ascertain from whence the cufflink came? The jeweler, for example?" Lestrade shifted in his chair. "Seemed unnecessary. Man's cufflink turns up where he's no right to be. What more would you need? Besides, the jury didn't trouble over it." Holmes allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Juries are not my concern, Lestrade. Facts are. And I have lately encountered one that casts your open and shut in a most curious light." The inspector's gaze flickered, just for an instant, at the mention of Paris and Jules Marat. "If there's been a confession over there, that's for the French to sort out," he muttered. "Our case is closed." "Closed?" Holmes repeated softly, as though tasting the word. He gathered the file and rose. "Thank you for your time, Inspector. I shall not detain you further." But as we stepped back into the wind-scoured street, I caught the gleam in Holmes' eye that told me the interview had revealed more than Lestrade intended. The fog had thickened by the time we turned into Belgrave Square, so that the lamps shone like pale moons in a yellowish haze. Lady Charlotte Ashcombe received us in her drawing-room, a chamber as grand as any in London, yet touched by that faint chill peculiar to houses where the servants, rather than the mistress, preside over the daily order. "My dear Mr. Holmes," she said, extending a gloved hand, "I had thought the matter of my necklace quite behind us." "I, too, had thought so, Lady Charlotte," Holmes replied with his most affable bow. Yet the passage of time sometimes casts a new light upon the familiar. I should like to trouble you with a few questions, if I may. She waved a delicate hand toward the settee. By all means, though I cannot think what more there is to tell. Holmes seated himself, one long leg crossed over the other. On the night of your gala, you were, I believe, in the ballroom at the time the theft occurred? Yes. I had just concluded a dance with Lord Ashcombe when one of the maids whispered to me that something was amiss. And your husband's reaction? She hesitated, her fan making a soft tapping against her palm. Strangely composed. He told me to remain calm, that these matters could be settled discreetly. Indeed, he spoke more of the inconvenience to our guests than of the loss itself. Holmes' gaze flickered to me for a brief moment before returning to her. And the insurance claim? Was it met promptly? Oh yes, she said, almost with relief. Lloyd's paid without quibble within the week. It was most fortunate as... She stopped herself, her lips tightening ever so slightly, as there were certain expenses at the time. I see, said Holmes, rising smoothly. You have been most helpful, Lady Charlotte. Should I have further questions? May I call upon you again? Of course, Mr. Holmes, though I confess I am puzzled by your renewed interest. Out in the thickening fog once more, Holmes thrust his hands deep into the pockets of his coat. There is an odor of quiet compromise about that house, Watson, and I do not trust a silence so carefully maintained. The following morning found Holmes bent over a ledger in the back room of a discreet broker's office off Cornhill. A mutual acquaintance at Lloyd's had consented, under the seal of Holmes' discretion, to show us the record of the Ashcombe claim. You will note, Watson, Holmes murmured, tapping a long finger upon the neat columns, that the settlement was not only prompt but uncommonly generous. More to the point, observe here. The entry to which he pointed bore the name of a banking house in which Lord Ashcombe had, at that time, an account. Cross-referenced against the broker's private list, it revealed debts in excess of £5,000, most of it pressing. It is beginning to assume an ugly shape, Holmes said quietly, closing the ledger. A shape in which Latimer appears less the villain and more the scapegoat. We had scarcely returned to Baker Street when a knock came at the door, and a young messenger handed Holmes a hastily scribbled note. He scanned it, and for the first time in many weeks I saw the easy composure drain from his features. Watson, he said sharply, Latimer has left his lodgings without notice. His landlady reports he departed before dawn, taking only a small valise. You think he means to confront Ashcombe? I asked. I think, Holmes replied grimly, that an innocent man, robbed of 3 years, might seek his own justice where the law has failed him, and I... He pressed his lips together. Have furnished him the motive. For a moment he stood by the window, staring into the murk of the street below. If harm comes of this, Watson, it will be my gravest professional error, and the first for which I cannot claim detachment. It was rare to hear such words from Holmes, and rarer still to see him motionless, as if weighed down by a truth he could not yet refute. The light of the street lamps blurred against the fog, and I felt the case sliding towards a darkness that no deduction could easily dispel. That evening, Holmes took to pacing the length of our sitting room, his dressing gown trailing behind him like a shadow. The fire burned low, throwing restless shapes upon the walls, and the ticking of the mantel clock marked the silence between his abrupt turns. I have gone over the sequence a dozen times, Watson, he said abruptly. There is one detail, small, almost contemptibly so, that refuses to rest. The cufflink. Precisely. He halted, eyes narrowing. In court, Lestrade described it as gilt, not gold. Do you recall? I searched my memory. Yes, and he remarked upon a faint mark upon the back. An insignia, I think. Holmes' hands came together in a sudden clasp. A maker's mark. I have seen it before. It is the stamp of Duval Frères, a jeweler in the Rue de la Paix, Paris. They are purveyors of fine ornaments and, more to the point, occasional accomplices to our friend Jules Marat. I started. Then the cufflink could never have been Latimer's unless, Holmes interjected. He had purchased it in Paris. which he had not. Latimer was in Brighton at the time of its sale, a fact easily established from the hotel register. He strode to the desk, flipping through his index of criminals and their associates until he drew out a thin slip. Here is the connection. Marat, 2 months before the theft, was in London. And with him, according to my notes, was Lord Ashcombe, under the pretext of negotiating the purchase of a French horse. Holmes turned to me, the lines of fatigue in his face offset by a gleam of renewed purpose. Watson, this is no longer a question of a false inference. It is a matter of deliberate manufacture, evidence planted to destroy one man and shield another. And Latimer? If he has gone to Ashcombe, he may not wait for the luxury of proof. We must find him before this night is out. Within minutes, Holmes had exchanged his dressing gown for his overcoat, thrust a revolver into his pocket, and summoned a cab from the rank at the corner. The fog hung thick over London, blurring the outlines of passers-by and muffling the sound of hoofbeats as we rattled eastward. His lordship maintains an estate near Chislehurst, Holmes said curtly as we jolted along. If Latimer has gone there, we may yet be in time. But every moment's delay increases the chance of an irrevocable act. I studied his profile in the dim cablight. There was no trace of the languid indifference he sometimes assumed for minor cases. Instead, his features were taut, his eyes fixed on some unseen calculation. "You take this much to heart, Holmes?" I ventured. He gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Watson, in my profession one grows accustomed to error, provided it belongs to another. But this was mine. An error of assumption, born of the conceit that my chain of reasoning was unbreakable. If Latimer dies by his own hand or another's, that blood will lie, in part, upon mine." The cab swayed to a halt as the driver peered into the murk. "Best we take the road by the common, sir," he called down. "The main way's near impassable with this fog." "On then," Holmes urged. We pressed forward, the lamps casting little islands of light into the surrounding gloom. From time to time, Holmes consulted his watch, each glance accompanied by a tightening of his jaw. "At worst," he muttered, "we arrive too late and must content ourselves with the ashes of what might have been saved. At best." He broke off, his gaze sharpening as the dim outline of tall gates loomed through the vapor. "At best, Watson, we intervene at the very brink. Which I mean to do." The great gates of Ashcombe Hall swung open with a protesting creak, and we strode up the gravel drive, our boots crunching in the silence. A dim glow shone from a ground-floor window at the far end of the facade. Holmes motioned me to follow closely, and together we crossed the terrace to a side entrance left carelessly ajar. From within came the low murmur of voices, one hard and trembling with contained fury, the other deep and unsteady. Stepping softly, we reached the doorway of the library and looked in. Harold Latimer stood in the center of the carpet, his coat damp from the night mist. In his right hand he held a small pistol, trained upon Lord Ashcombe, who had retreated behind the desk, his knuckles white upon its edge. "You'll answer me tonight," Latimer was saying. "You'll tell me why you let me rot while you feasted on your insurance money." Ashcombe's eyes darted toward us, but he made no move to call out. Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm yet edged with command. "Mr. Latimer, put down the pistol. Your quarrel lies not with vengeance, but with the truth, and I have brought that truth with me." Latimer's head turned sharply. "Truth? What truth could undo 3 years?" "The truth," Holmes said, advancing a step, "that the cufflink was not yours, but purchased in Paris by Jules Marat at the behest of the gentleman before you, that you were placed at the scene by design, so the real author of the theft might escape unscathed." Latimer's arm wavered, his eyes searching Holmes' face. "And will you swear to that?" "Upon my professional honor," Holmes replied gravely, "and before Scotland Yard itself if need be. I will see your name cleared, Mr. Latimer, but only if you let me do so without the shadow of another crime to your account." The pistol sagged, then dropped into Latimer's other hand. With a shuddering breath, he placed it on the desk. "Very well, Mr. Holmes, but I'll not forget the years you owe me." Holmes inclined his head, then fixed his gaze upon Ashcombe, whose face had blanched to the color of parchment. Holmes moved round the desk with the unhurried precision of a man arranging his pieces upon a chessboard. "Lord Ashcombe," he began, "you may have thought this matter buried with the verdict against Latimer. Yet the soil has shifted, and what was buried has risen to the surface." Ashcombe straightened, affecting a composure that did not reach his eyes. "You make bold accusations, sir." "I make none that I cannot prove," Holmes returned. From the inner pocket of his coat, he drew a narrow envelope and laid it upon the desk. "This is the bill of sale for a pair of gilt cufflinks, bearing the Duval Frères mark, purchased in Paris 2 months prior to the theft. The buyer, according to the shop's register, was yourself, and the witness to the sale, Jules Marat." Ashcombe's lips moved soundlessly, then closed in a hard line. "At the time," Holmes continued evenly, "your debts amounted to a sum the necklace would more than cover. Insurance was paid within a week, your creditors satisfied, and Latimer, innocent, was dispatched to prison. The elegance of the arrangement would be admirable, were it not so very criminal." At this juncture the door opened, and Inspector Lestrade stepped in, his eyes taking in the tableau with keen interest. Holmes' earlier telegram, dispatched from the cab, had brought him to the scene. "I believe, Lestrade," Holmes said, "that you will find the elements of a charge for conspiracy to defraud, and perhaps theft, in what you have just heard." Ashcombe's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. "It was never meant to go so far," he muttered. "Marat swore the man would be acquitted. When the verdict came, I let it stand." Lestrade advanced, producing a pair of handcuffs. "That will do, my lord. You'll tell the rest to the magistrate." Holmes stepped back, his gaze shifting briefly to Latimer, whose expression mingled vindication with a weary bitterness that no mere arrest could dispel. 2 mornings later, Holmes and I stood within the sober walls of Scotland Yard, the pale winter light filtering through the barred windows. Latimer sat across from Superintendent Baines, the necessary papers for the expungement of his conviction spread before them. Holmes, his manner crisp but without its usual edge, addressed the superintendent. "You have Ashcombe's signed confession, the corroboration from Duval Frères, and Marat's statement from Paris. I trust there will be no impediment to striking Mr. Latimer's name from the criminal rolls." Baines nodded gravely. "The law moves slowly, Mr. Holmes, but in this case it shall move cleanly. We will see it done." Latimer's eyes, darkened by years of confinement, shifted from Baines to Holmes. "I thank you for clearing my name, but you must know that those years are gone. No truth, however fine, will give them back." Holmes inclined his head, the faintest shadow crossing his features. "You are correct, Mr. Latimer. Time's ledger cannot be altered. I can only ensure that its remaining pages bear the right account." Latimer gave a tight nod, signed the last document, and rose. For a moment he seemed about to speak further, but instead turned and left without another word. When the door had closed, I looked at Holmes. "That was as near to an apology as I have ever heard you make." He met my gaze steadily. "And as near as I hope I shall ever need to." He glanced down at the papers, now marked and sealed. "Come, Watson. We have done what could be done. The rest lies beyond even my reach." We stepped out into the cold morning air, the yard's great doors swinging shut behind us, and I sensed that for once Holmes walked not with the satisfaction of a case concluded, but with the weight of one too long delayed. That evening found us once more in our familiar Baker Street sitting room. The fog outside pressed against the panes, and the fire cast a steady glow over Holmes' lean figure as he sat motionless in his chair, his hands steepled beneath his chin. For some time he said nothing, the only sound the faint hiss of the coal and the occasional creak of the wicker basket beneath the kettle. At last he spoke, not lifting his gaze from the hearth. "Watson, the detective's art is often likened to a blade sharp, precise, and unerring when well forged. Yet even the keenest edge may turn in the hand that wields it, should pride guide the stroke instead of truth." I set down my book. "You have been hard upon yourself in this matter, Holmes. The deception was skillfully wrought. Many would have been misled." He gave a faint smile, though it held no vanity. "Perhaps, But the duty of our profession is not merely to be right, it is to be certain. I allowed the appearance of certainty to stand in for its reality. The cost of that indulgence was 3 years of an innocent man's liberty. His gaze drifted to the window, where the lamplight shimmered faintly in the fog. Let it be a lesson, Watson. We are servants of truth, not of our own reputations. When those two come into conflict, the latter must give way without hesitation. I made no reply, for there was a tone in his voice that needed no answer. We sat together in companionable silence, the shadows lengthening about us, while outside the city's murmur faded into the night. And so ended a case in which Holmes' greatest triumph lay not in the brilliance of his deduction, but in the candor with which he faced the one adversary none of us can wholly escape, our own fallibility. And so ends the case that tested not only Holmes' mind, but his conscience. If you enjoyed this journey into Victorian London's shadows, be sure to give this video a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss another mystery. Your support helps keep these stories alive and reaching more listeners around the world.